Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from IGI Cyber Labs. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes talking about how do you move towards compliance. That has been a critical topic to a lot of SMB leaders and owners of organizations as compliance and regulations have becoming more and more important. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We are just waiting for people to log on to today's session. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stuart Cohen from IGI Cyber Labs. Thank you very much for attending our session today. This is a continuation of our SMB educational webinar series, where we are providing a series of public service announcements for the SMB community on how the SMB leaders, SMB owners, CEOs, CFOs, and COOs of small and medium-sized businesses can learn a few things about how to get started as it relates to cybersecurity. Specifically, the issues that are on people's minds are, how do I make my organization just a little bit more secure? How do I provide a little bit better confidentiality of our data? How do I improve the integrity of our systems? And God forbid, if something were to happen from an attack standpoint, from a business continuity standpoint, what can we do to get back up and running as a business? Today's session is around moving towards compliance as investors in small businesses and boards of small businesses are consistently asking the question, are we protected and what are we doing to be more compliant? The CIS 18 is a great opportunity for those businesses to start to move towards becoming compliant with all of the different regulations that are out there today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to bring to everyone's attention. As always, for those of you that have been on our sessions in the past, we'd like these to be interactive. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to them. Also, on social media, please join our LinkedIn events. It's an opportunity for you to have an ongoing collaboration and dialogue with your peers on a variety of different topics. Not only this one, but all the ones that we've covered in the past. Also submit topics and presenters that you would like us to hear from in this series. We also have upcoming events that are on nodeware.com's events. For instance, we have Bradford Wilkie from CISA coming up in a couple of weeks talking about things they're doing specifically for the remote and hybrid workforces. That is something that's very important to people with a number of people that are still working remote and probably will be working remote forever. We also have some folks from the industry talking about security frameworks and cyber resiliency coming up on December 2nd. And then Lisa from the National Cybersecurity Alliance talking about building an effective company cyber culture. So we've got a couple of great sessions coming up in the future. Feel free to go to our website to get registered for those. And we want to continue the dialogue on how do we help small businesses, once again, take a few simple steps, as well as helping them getting connected to managed service providers and managed security service providers that can help them and assist them locally with the issues they're going through. So with that, please feel free to put things in the chat box. We have a couple of poll questions and a couple of survey questions at the end. We'd appreciate if you fill out. But without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers today. We're fortunate enough to have Phyllis Lee with us. She's the Senior Director of Controls at the Center for Internet Security. And Tony Sager, who did a session for us early in the year, talking about the CIS 18. He is the godfather of vulnerability management and security. We are fortunate enough to have him with us and the work that he's been doing over the years, and to provide some perspective on what small businesses can do as we move into this new area of, updated regulations, updating compliance requirements, and how small businesses can take a few simple steps. So with that, I will turn it over to Phyllis and to Tony for them to go ahead and get started, and then we will ask them questions that come in through the chat box, as well as some questions that were submitted in advance. So with that, Tony, Phyllis, I'll turn it over to you.
Great.
Well, thanks very much, Stuart. Yeah, let me just start for a little context here and then turn it over to Phyllis. And sometimes I get that term godfather of whatever, and it's I think more tribute to my age than my accomplishment, but I appreciate it. And thanks for having me back. One thing we really appreciate at the Center for Internet Security is your passion for this small, medium business problem. This has been a big focus of ours for several years now. And the challenge, right? The biggest companies in our economy are struggling to defend themselves. And now look at the plight of small, medium businesses. And for us, we have at the center, we have a specific responsibility for state and local governments, most of whom are frankly well underfunded and face the same struggles as the small businesses. So this is the backbone of our country and our economy, and we have to do better around it. So as far as the controls, let me just very briefly summarize. We are a best practices organization, right? We both practice them and we create them, and we're a small nonprofit, but we work with a large volunteer community across the entire industry to create these best practices, support them, and then make them available free to the public. We support the company through a membership type model and some licensing through some of the companies. So I'm part of the we'll call it the version 0 story of the controls, right? When it was just a simple notion and a 2-page letter. After I retired from government service back in 2012, I wound up getting back involved with this, and somewhere between version 4 and 5, I wound up taking over again, leading the next couple of revisions. And now, my longstanding friend and colleague Phyllis Lee has taken over completely and led the version 8 revision, which we released in conjunction with RSA this year. And so, there's been a real evolution, maturity of the approach. Lots more people involved, lots more ecosystem built around it. So I think there's we're happy to address any of those questions or where we're going with that or what we've done to any of the listeners here. And then I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis to give us a little kind of background of her involvement in this and some of the things that she tried to do with version 8. So it's, again, Phyllis is part of that evolution and maturing. When I first took this over, it was literally a kind of a hip pocket operation with lots of email feedback, but really no structure, really not a company to speak of. It was sort of an ad hoc volunteer project. Under Phyllis's leadership, it's really turned into a machine now with a team and a lot of supporting structure that makes the work even better and more available to all those that need it. So Phyllis, over to you, please.
Right. So thank you, Tony, for that very nice intro. I do want to say one thing. While Tony will say his was kind of ad hoc, a lot of the things, the reason why he is the godfather, because a lot of things that he does just kind of stays with us, right? It's otherwise he's just a one-hit wonder. So this could be a whole nother talk, but when you run a group and you're trying to come to consensus, it doesn't mean 100% agreement. And so what we really, I have to give a nod to Tony, we have these guiding principles that really are the foundation of what the controls are today. They have to be achievable, they have to be relevant, they have to actually, defend against real world threats, because everyone comes to the table with their favorite kind of security idea, what they believe is important, what they think is number one, and we have to have these guiding principles. And really those are the foundation of the controls. And so when we went into creating controls version 8, we kept those guiding principles that Tony created several years ago. And we said, why is it time for controls version 8? Well, we came to the tipping point where we really needed to implement or include new technologies such as cloud as well as mobile into the main document, right? We do have companion guides, but it was time to really address those. And so, incidentally, there was a pandemic while we were creating the controls, and there was a wholesale movement to cloud and to remote work. So it actually ended up being pretty timely that we did that. We also wanted to combine redundant controls and safeguards and, reorder them. So for example, we used to have a separate control for network boundary, as well as controls for your standard endpoints. And underneath those supporting subcontrols or safeguards had the same exact, they were the same exact subcontrols or safeguards, but we updated it to combine those. And again, that really is a nod to the fact that networks today are really borderless. I sat in a talk where someone says the end of your network is where your users' fingertips are, right? Everyone's working remotely. It's not like this, nice little cloud and firewalls on the edges of the cloud, and we're all internal. We really are, diverse. We're all over. Some people are all over the world, et cetera. And so by doing that, we got rid of redundant controls. We really more combined by activity versus how things are managed. And we also really tried to have consistent language to make sure that organizations really could understand, what we were talking about. If you want to go to the next slide. So yeah, so what you see is we ended up with 18 controls. And what's interesting, even though we combined like controls and safeguards, we ended up with a new control called service provider management, and that's control 15. And what that really is a nod to is, again, organizations are moving to cloud. We have to help them understand that you have to manage your cloud service provider. I was in a talk where Tony said, that shared responsibility, he's kind of, like, well, it's not really a shared responsibility. You get what you pay for, right? And so that's what really that service provider management is. Many organizations perhaps think they're getting their asset management, think they're getting that backup and restore, but you have to make sure it's written down because you're paying for every single service that you get. If you look at the reordering, we still have inventory and controls of enterprise assets, as well as software as number 1 and 2, but we actually moved up data protection, which was control, I think 11, up to number 3 now. And again, the community spoke. They said, you know what? When I look at my enterprise, what's on there? What software is on those? What software is on my assets, my enterprise assets? And then where's my sensitive data? And from there, I'm going to look at my cybersecurity program, and then I'll determine where do I need secure configuration? Where do I need to limit access, et cetera? Because we know that organizations cannot, implement all the controls and all the supporting safeguards all at once. You really need to stage it, and you need to determine perhaps some assets need more protections than other assets. And it just makes sense, right? Know where your sensitive data is, put in the correct controls in front of your sensitive data. And so really that's how controls version 8 came about. We've had a lot of positive feedback. We have a community on our custom tool workbench, and we continue to ask for your feedback. We get the feedback, and we have our Confluence page on, feedback and things that we could possibly improve for version 8.1, which no worries, we're going to hold off. We don't want to put out things too quickly because we understand it takes a while for organizations to actually implement the controls. Another thing that we continued from version 7.1 is implementation groups. And so one of the strengths of the controls is that they're a prioritized set of activities. Organizations often ask us, where should I start? And this is an excellent question, right? So what we did is we looked at an organization's risk to their enterprise, the kind of data that they're responsible for protecting, the resources that they have to dedicate towards IT as well as cyber, and then we binned our safeguards that way. And we call this new prioritization implementation groups. So implementation group 1, or IG1, is comprised of 56 safeguards, and it's really geared towards small, medium businesses. Our expectation is that small, medium businesses don't have high value data. They don't really have an IT staff, as well as they certainly don't have a cybersecurity staff. So we're hoping that those safeguards in IG1 are achievable and not too costly. And the feedback that we've gotten so far has generally been positive. Implementation group 2 is geared towards organizations that are subject to some regulation. They have more responsibility to protect their data, as well as an IT staff. Perhaps maybe one person dedicated to cyber. And implementation group 3 encompasses all the safeguards because implementation groups build upon each other. And so an IG3 organization is what you would consider like a Goldman Sachs, a big bank, has a lot of resources subject to a lot of regulatory frameworks as well as targeted. And so really you need to be implementing a full cybersecurity program to protect the data that you're responsible for.
Hey,
So
Phyllis,
this is, go ahead.
so I was just going to, the Nodeware Advisory Council that we put together earlier this year suggested that we put together this educational series based on the fact that, there's 645,000 small businesses in the United States between, 20 employees and 500 employees, and about 70% of them, 70, don't have a single IT or security person.
Right.
And we've had people like Alan Alford on talk about the 3 legs of the stool, right? That they should get started with, doing a vulnerability management scan, understand what's exploitable, and then implementing some multi-factor authentication and maybe a little bit of training, right? And they got to find a partner to do all 3 of those things. We've had people at MIT talk about some initial training that's going on. Are there a couple of things, that you would suggest maybe, one of those organizations that doesn't have an IT person, what should they do to begin with on a group 1 first couple of steps kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. So, we are calling implementation group 1 essential cyber hygiene. We've done the work to back those choices with data. What's the biggest bang for your buck? What is it that you can do to help actually defend against real world threats? Tony will go more into really what does that essential cyber hygiene mean. But for the top 2, we looked across the different attack types, and we found that having a secure configuration and actually using MFA are some of the top 2 things that you can do. So of course, we always recommend count what you have, you don't know, we always say you can't defend against what you don't know you have, right? So, those foundational things like, count your assets, what software do you have on, where is that sensitive data? However, we don't think you have an IT staff, so we don't think you'll be able to run a vulnerability management tool, right? So if you can, please have a secure configuration and please implement MFA. There are free things out there for organizations to implement MFA. So
yeah, it's one of the key, the key part of what we're doing with this educational series is not only educating small business owners and leaders, but also matching them up with an MSP or MSSP that locally can provide them the assistance they need. Because to your point, right, they don't have the skills in-house to get started. They don't have the budget or the commitment of time to do it. So, we are spending as much time matching them up with the appropriate local assistance as anything else.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, I was just going to say, so yeah, and that's a wonderful way to help people get started. And part of when you look at this list here, right? I think that the history of the security business we've actually done backwards, right? We security wizards, right, who live and breathe technology, 24/7. And they go, well, why don't you people understand it the way we do and defend yourselves? We create complicated tools and, high-tech language and so forth. If you look at this list here, right, every one of these really corresponds to plain language business questions. Like, do I know what I have? Well, anybody who doesn't know what's in their warehouse, right, is not running a business very tightly. And so the kind of questions you would ask in physical space, frankly, we should, rather than make fun of people who don't understand technology, no, they're running a business. And so what do I have? What state it is in? Who can change the locks on my security systems, right? That kind of stuff. All the natural questions that we should ask about business, you can correspond to these technical things in space. So whether you do it yourself, which requires a lot of investment in people and so forth, or you ask someone else to do it, those are the kind of questions, right, that a business owner should be able to ask and frankly get an answer and not be made fun of because they don't speak, this fancy language that some of us grew up with. So you're exactly right, is to help people kind of get these questions whether they answer it for themselves, whether they buy a tool to do it, or whether they really ask a service provider to do it for them. So that's really, I think, a lot of what drives our motivation and what Phyllis talked about, right? When we develop these things, we're really conscious of, this the community that is not living technology 24/7. We grew up in the era of big governments and big federal agencies with big IT staffs, and by the way, even they struggle. And so it's insane to think that we could sort of foist this technology problem on small businesses. And as you pointed out, right, I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of small businesses that are really the backbone of our economy? So this is why we take the approach there. This is a driver for us. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think it's terrific. We put together something for our partners that says, in 1 minute, you ought to be able to ask a couple of questions, right? Do you know what devices potentially are exploitable by the bad guys? And two, do you or is someone in your organization alerted when a new device comes on your network that could be a problem? And if you care about the answers to either one of those two questions, then we very quickly want to get them connected with an MSP or MSSP to help them. And so we think in a minute and 2 or 3 questions, you can quickly determine, kind of what is your concern, what is your appetite for doing something, and who can help you do that.
Yep, you're speaking Phyllis's language now. I can see her smiling because that's exactly right. Those are reasonable questions for a business person to ask of their technology provider, right? And we should be able, frankly, technology should be able to help them with those.
Correct. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just, you were talking about something that is kind of near and dear to my heart, and I wanted to bring that part up.
No, that's great. And I will tell you, Tony and our leadership at CIS and myself included, we are very focused on small, medium businesses, which is how implementation groups came about, which is how we thought, really what you'll hear in the community a lot from the US government. And I'm attending a conference, someone said they had bad cyber hygiene. What does that even mean? We're grading you on your cyber hygiene. We're not going to necessarily detail what that means, but we're telling you it's bad. Your cyber hygiene is bad. And so I hear that all the time. And, the great leadership, we said, we hear that, but what does that mean? Let's actually define it. Let's draw a line in the sand and say, this is cyber hygiene or essential cyber hygiene. And so Tony, one of the great thinkers about that, I'm going to hand it over to him so he can expound further on, what our thoughts would be, what it really means.
Well, I used to call cyber hygiene the most used, least defined term in the business, right? People say it, and what they do is they give you a couple examples, right? We need to focus on cyber hygiene like patching. We need to focus on hygiene like configurations, right? So they give examples, but our view is if you don't have a definition, then it's pretty hard to plan a campaign, right? It's pretty hard to identify what do I want my service provider to do for me. And so we formalized that notion some time ago at CIS, and now we call it essential cyber hygiene. And when Phyllis talked about implementation group 1, that's what that means to us, right? Those are equivalent terms. Implementation group 1 is essential cyber hygiene. And it's, people have different views on this, but they're sort of like, oh, that's just hygiene. Well, we've studied this a lot. Hygiene provides a ton of value, right, without asking people to become experts. And this is modeled after things like public health. I started using the term, I actually dug back through my notes, and the earliest reference I could find was like 2003 or something like that. And it turned out one of the gods of the internet, Vince Cerf, I think, used it in the very late 90s in some congressional testimony. I just found the reference a few weeks ago. But the idea is a solid one, right? That is, there's a set of things that people need to do. No one of them cures the problem, but they're fairly low cost, they're easy to explain, they're quite accessible, and they provide demonstrable value. And one way to think of it is they sort of take complicated science, the attack vectors and all this stuff, that most people don't understand. It takes all of that stuff and translates it into behavior. So in public health, we'd say, wash your hands, get your shots, don't cough on people, avoid certain kinds of locations. Now, in theory, in fact, in practice, those are backed up by science, right? You know, washing your hands doesn't cure diseases, but it interrupts the transmission vector that allows a lot of things to pass from person to person. And on any given day, do I know that there's germs on my hands that will affect me if I shake hands with Phyllis? Well, no, but it doesn't cost me much to do it either, right? It's reasonable to do, it's explainable, and it's backed up. And if the science changes, and by the way, we saw it change during the pandemic, right? How long do you wash your hands? Well, that became like, you know, a discussion among scientists that we would translate into behavior, you know, sing this song or count to 25 or whatever the magic thing happened to be, right? So think of the fancy version of that as I'm translating science into behavioral. And so this idea is an important one for us. It's also a way that we use, as Phyllis described, to help people get started. You know, don't try to solve world hunger at this meeting. Let's just get the basics down. And again, these are not throwaway things. You know, there's lots of analysis we can tell you about that says, you know, if you can kind of do the basics, and Stuart, you live and breathe this sort of stuff, right? Because you talk about all the time about inventory and, you know, that visibility and when new things come on. If you can do those, you actually have tremendous value against the most common attacks that are out there. You know, there's a tendency to say, well, the bad guys are 10 feet tall and they do magic, but the reality is not that. The reality is that we see millions of repeats of the same attacks over and over again. And so it's really important to get these foundational things done. So that's our theory of the case behind hygiene.
We'll have another webinar on how long my wife thinks you ought to be washing your hands during COVID, but that's another discussion for another day.
That's funny. And so, you know, I just wanted to kind of follow what Tony said. You know, he really drums home this idea of not everyone can do that analysis like the CDC, right? And so what is it that we at CIS can do on behalf of these other organizations that aren't funded, or maybe are funded but aren't going to take the time to do that? And so we came up with the community defense model. What we wanted to be able to say is, you know, past the fact that a bunch of smart people got in a room and decided on a bunch of good things to do, we decided to back that with data. So we looked at multiples of different threat reports, and we looked at what are the top 5 attack types. And the good news is, amongst all those different threat reports, of which my analyst Felicia looked at tens of and international ones, the top 5 attacks were pretty much the same. Perhaps the order was different, like, you know, malware and ransomware was maybe number 1 or number 2, or insider threat was like 4 on one report or 5 on another. But the top 5 attack types really are the same across all the different threat reports, as well as have been fairly consistent over the last 5 to 7 years. So what we're here to say is essential cyber hygiene has stood the test of time. And so you can, it's not like it's going to change every year. It's going to be pretty consistent. We always want you to wash your hands. We always, you know, want you to know what's on your network, right? And so we did that work, you know, on behalf of organizations. We're the experts. We got the room of experts together. That's what we do. We do things consensus-based. And we mapped out, what do those attacks look like? What are those attack patterns? And then we mapped at the safeguard level, how is it that the CIS critical security controls can actually defend against those top attacks? And so we broke those attacks apart. We showed how we could mitigate along those different steps in the different attack types. And we could say, you know, implementation group 1, if you implement essential cyber hygiene, you can effectively defend against these top 5 attacks. Of course, the more safeguards or controls you implement, the higher your coverage is along, you know, those different steps in that attack life cycle. However, is basic, or is essential cyber hygiene good enough? Yes, we stand behind the work. You don't have to defend against every little step in an attack in order to defend against that attack. And so we're very excited to say that. And we're the only framework to date that has done that work. And so, you know, start with essential cyber hygiene, and you can really defend your network.
Yeah. One of the things that drives us, Stuart, is that, you know, I try to think of this, the way I tried to think of the problem over the years was, what is it that we implicitly expect every company in this economy to do number one, that they can't do, and that they don't have to do by themselves. So this idea, Phyllis gave the example, right? We have, lots of volunteers and our own staff. We are reading in great detail the threat reports that come from Verizon, and CrowdStrike, and Palo Alto, and all these companies. Right? In theory, every company in the economy should go do that. In practice, almost none can. They just don't have the people or the time. And the point is not to just read those things, and they're interesting, right? If you're in this business, the point is, how do I translate them into action? And when you look at the mass of attacks, right? If we expect every company in our economy to go do that, we're doomed. It won't happen. And here's the good news, though: they don't have to, because all of that sort of applies to everybody, right? On any given day in the internet, I would say if you're not the victim, you're the jump point, or you're the bystander waiting for tomorrow and see what that brings. You can't ignore all that. There's just a soup of bad stuff that we just have to deal with, kind of like we do again in public health and other domains of risk, that we need to translate into action, but we can't expect everyone to do it on their own, and they don't have to. Like we talked about the public health issue, right? What is the understanding, all this threat intelligence, and what is all these great companies, what are they telling us about bad guys and what they're doing? And then how do I translate that into action? And we try to embody that answer in the thing you see on the screen here, right? The controls, and translate it into something that people can make sense of and not have to read those thousands of pages of highly complex technical information, because that's just, again, a recipe for disaster. There are some companies, by the way, that have lots at risk, are willing to spend a ton of money, right? Because that's the business they're in, and read all that stuff and hire the right people and so forth. But that is so far the exception rather than the rule. And so we're really trying to help people, get the right things identified, but without having to become experts themselves. And I think that's important. The other thing I'll mention is that, we're very conscious of our place in the ecosystem, which is, hey, we must love security frameworks in this industry because we have so many of them, right? They're everywhere. And again, imagine the small business owner trying to say, what do I do about PCI? What do I do about this CMMC thing and this cybersecurity framework and all? There's just so many of them that we know lots of experts in this who can barely keep up with all these things. So what we do at CIS is, when we produce our guidance, our recommendations, our safeguards here, right? We try to simplify this problem we have committed to provide a mapping from everything we do to everything else that we can find. Whether it's PCI, whether it's the 800-53 catalog from NIST or the CSF or there's a gazillion of these acronyms out there. Because if we don't do that, somebody else has to do that, right? The poor small business owner or the government agency or whoever. And so we believe it's part of our responsibility to be conscious of there's all these other things that our adopters have to deal with, and they don't have the time or the people to do it. So we do it, and we publish it again, make it available to the public for no charge, because that's just part of what the sort of value that we can bring, as a nonprofit in this space.
To that point, we have a couple of poll questions. One, specifically about kind of what is your role, what is your involvement, how does it relate to controls that would be put in place in your organization? I think it's worth putting the first poll question up just to get a feedback from the audience on kind of how they fit into these different areas, and that might influence a question or two that we get as well. So if we could put the first poll question up, I think that might lead to some good discussion. And then while they're answering that, maybe we could talk for a second about, once again, kind of the first few steps towards compliance that someone could take, to address the top 5 threats that you kind of referred to. I think it'd be worth kind of reiterating that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I think, we would always say is, we've been asked a lot about ransomware as well, and we kind of have this kind of back to the basics or do the foundational things. And I'm actually at a utilities conference, and the number one thing I think is always the hardest things to do, which is our number 1 and number 2, and our number 3, which is know what you have, right? Get that hardware asset management or enterprise asset management, software asset management, and then where's your high value data, right? And then after that, again, if you look at the technical controls, the highest priority thing that you can do after that really is have a secure configuration. I think one of the reasons why is, when you have a secure configuration, there are many other probably safeguards rolled into there, like turning on patching for your operating system, turning on firewalls, etc. But that really is the number one thing you can do, as well as the data is pointing us towards MFA. The bulk of attacks that we're seeing out there have to do with credential theft. And the number one thing that you can do to defend against credential theft is use MFA.
Phyllis, I think that's a great example. And another theme, Stuart, when you're trying to come up with the first things to do, I think security is a classic case of perfection is the enemy of the good. All right, so as soon as you say MFA and say, yeah, but don't do it with SMS because the bad guy can get in the way, and got it? Yeah, of course. But no matter what defensive technique you used, right? There's, again, there's 10 ways that might be costly, cumbersome, probably doesn't apply to you, et cetera. And we often get paralyzed because we think it perfect, because security people like me will tell you, oh, that's a lovely thing you're going to do there, Phyllis, but we got 10 other ways to attack you. And it may be technically true, but as a practical matter, if it paralyzes you, it's a waste of time. So SMS, MFA is a classic one. Inventory is another one, right? That is, oh, you need a $50,000 tool to track the inventory and make sure everything's perfect on your network. If you wait for perfection, you'll never be able to make a decision, right? And so, frankly, for a lot of small networks, we recommend running around with a piece of paper and a piece of grid paper and a pencil, because knowing what you have, right, is the start. You're not going to get perfection, right? Our world changes dynamically. There's lots of things going on, and there's actually pretty low cost and often, no cost technology that will be good enough for the purpose. And so, those first steps ought to be coupled with an attitude, right? Don't let perfection cripple you. Again, if you bring in expensive consultants, and there's wonderful, great consultants that are incredibly helpful, you know that, Stuart, but don't let them paralyze you with nothing's good enough, because I think that has held us back from kind of basic things, right? It's easy to dream up 50 things, new exceptions to every rule, but that doesn't really help anybody make progress.
Well, to your point, right? I talked about those two questions, right? Do someone in your organization know what devices are exploitable by the bad guys? And, is anybody in your organization getting alerted when a new device comes on your network during normal business hours? And, we through Nodeware, through our MSPs, provide those answers, for about $1 a month per device. So it is very, very inexpensive to get the couple of quick answers to those quick questions. So it's certainly not, driving towards perfection. There's a way to get started, and there's a way to get started through our partners. I wanted to ask a question that we just got about what CIS is doing, and how can an MSP support the small business and the assets of a small business they're supporting, and how do they even introduce the idea to their clients if they've been, let's say, a desktop break fix kind of support before?
Yeah, so I have been working with a couple of MSP consortiums, and what's funny is one of the consortiums that I'm working with, after the Kaseya incident, they were like, oh, we have to work with all our clients now in secure configuration and MFA. And it's so funny because I'm like, yes, all the data is pointing to that. How sad that that was not being done prior. But it really is, like Tony says, when you talk about that shared responsibility, it really is, you get what you pay for. So will the MSP come to the table with those requirements? We hope so. I think that when you're an end organization, I've talked about this with MSPs, many MSPs are there to provide a service and don't necessarily have the security. That's the MSSP, and it's really up to that end organization to require it. So the question is, when you're an end organization and you go to an MSP, are you asking them, what framework are you implementing, or what kind of security services are you implementing? What security services are you offering? We are hoping that, essential cyber hygiene is a good starting point, perhaps, a way that someone could have a conversation. I think it's difficult. I've talked with small, medium organizations, and they're like, I'm the CFO, I'm in charge of actually creating the contract with my MSP, and I have no idea what it's supposed to look like. And, you know, do we have those guidelines there? Hopefully something around essential cyber hygiene can provide those guidelines. But again, it really has to be that cooperative kind of relationship or partnership with your MSP, because so often I have heard that there's just confusion on both sides. And
there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, Phyllis. You know, that at least the conversation a couple of years ago was, you know, talking to MSPs like, why don't you do more security? Well, no one asks us for security, right? There's no demand. Why would I spend money and train people and buy tools if there's no demand? But I think the conversation has changed and is heading in a different direction now. And part of it is the, you know, again, part of what you do, so, right? You're working both sides of that equation, right? What questions should the business owner ask when he outsources his IT or his security services? And then the answer, right? You want to come in a consistent way. Well, we follow this framework. We use, you know, these best practices, right? And so lining those up creates the marketplace that makes sense for everybody. We also heard, actually, Phyllis and I were on a panel yesterday, right, Phyllis, around insurance. And there was at least, this is an anecdote, but one managed service provider who is deciding that if my client is not using MFA, they're too risky for me to provide them with service. I'm going to stop serving people who don't put MFA in, because they're starting to get, and there is some discussion of this at the state legislative level, the idea of liability, heaven help us, for MSPs, right? And so there's sort of a national conversation, right? Whose responsibility is what? And so, you know, people are starting to worry. There's nothing like the threat or the concern with legislation to focus your attention and to say, you know, maybe we better get our act together. And so there's a lot of this back and forth going on right now about who is responsible for this, right? Who should be? And I think, you know, it can make us uncomfortable, especially as technologists. But if you look at the history of medical practice and commercial, airplane flights and the certifying of brain surgeons, you know, this is how society deals with risk, right? We have to codify behaviors in building codes and credentialing of people and things like that, not so that we get perfect decisions, so that we get an expectation. How do I make a decision? Is it safe to fly on this plane or use this doctor or this hospital? And, you know, we have mechanisms in place to help people with that. We don't ask them to become experts in it. And by the way, sometimes that decision is a bad decision, right? You know, that they didn't follow building code, they didn't, you know, whatever. And then, you know, again, that's part of risk, and that's part of what the courts sort out eventually, right? That who is responsible for things. So I think there's a lot of changing conversation now about this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say to that point, you know, we're seeing a lot of people ask us as they fill out a cyber insurance questionnaire, how do they handle what's now required as vulnerability management program versus in the past what was just a vulnerability management scan. And, you know, what can they get out of Nodeware and the dashboard to be able to provide the content for that, for them to be able to fill out that questionnaire, for them to be able to fill out that insurance, or maybe to re-up their premium. So, you know, maybe you could talk to a couple of things that you guys are doing in that regard to help them with that. And we are about to announce some things with a cyber insurance company that's focused on small businesses. And we're also looking at somebody that provides cyber liability to not only the end users, but in some cases through MSPs, to be able to provide a liability and or insurance around the data. So,
you know,
if you could comment,
Stuart, that's an incredibly important phrase that you used, you know, to us. That is the difference from a vulnerability scan versus a program, right? Because one is a moment in time, right? I do a scan and, hey, I passed the test. Okay, I'll see you next time. You know, any sensible questionnaire, insurance thing, regulatory, and I'm not saying they're all sensible, by the way, right, is more focused on what I call the machinery, right? It's not can I answer it once a year? It's what machinery do I have in place so I manage to it. And I think that's what you're implying here with the notion of a program, right? That is incredibly important. And maybe Phyllis, you could talk a little bit. So part of what we do at CIS is we try to design, when we ask for things, we try to think through the whole life cycle, right? How are they going to implement it? How will they test for it? How are they going to automate it? So Phyllis, you could share a little bit about our thinking there, because again, we're not trying to write the best paper list in the industry. We're trying to help people with the most progress and recognizing they have to measure, manage, and do all that. Phyllis?
Yeah, so actually, when we updated controls version 8, we did put in continuous vulnerability management, and the first 3 or 4 steps really around the machinery, like Tony says, like, what is your plan? What's your you first have a plan, have a remediation plan, then make sure you're automating, your updates to your OS, automating updates to apps, etc. So we do actually take those things into consideration within the controls. So that's actually nice the way the controls were updated, because so many organizations were like, it's more than just to scan. Just who cares if you scan, but do you fix what's in there and actually do that work? So it's interesting that the insurance companies are now actually asking for that. So I find that fascinating. And we also are asking, those that as part of essential cyber hygiene, as part of IG1, because you really just need to have that as a plan. And then, either try to figure out, do I engage with an MSP to execute that plan? Or, can I actually afford to do it on my own, etc. So, and I also will say that, this kind of leads into many times, it is hard, it is daunting, and organizations want to know, what tool can I just run, right? To try to get this done. And it is harder, especially for those small, medium businesses, like, who can I pay just to get this done, et cetera. And so, Tony talks about the ecosystem that we have built around this. And so we are trying to work with commercial vendors to ask them, hey, can you show compliance against essential cyber hygiene? We've written the specification so that hopefully organizations that have some tooling already on their networks can also automate against compliance against the actual controls.
Well, to that point, Tony, I was just going to say one thing. We're going to put up a second poll, and I think it'll help you talk to this. In the first poll, we had 55% of the people that are on today's session said they either work for or own a small business. So, that is clearly somebody that, we're looking to provide this service and public service announcement and education for. The next poll that we have is how many people use an MSP. So we're going to put that up there. Thank you very much. To give people an opportunity to answer this question, because I think the connection point of getting the MSPs to provide these to their end user clients, and at the same time, the end user clients to be able to answer the question to their investors, to their boards, and quite frankly, to themselves. What are we doing to move towards compliance? And I always come back to, integrity of the system, confidentiality of your data, business continuity and recovery. Because those are things, when I was the CEO of a small business, I always thought about it, and I was always concerned about. If somebody said to me, what are you doing about cyber hygiene? I'd like, I don't know, I got to figure out what cyber hygiene means. But when you talk to me about confidentiality, or when you talk to me about integrity of our data, or you talk to me about business continuity and relaunching our business, I certainly knew what that meant. Tony, any thoughts on that front?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we attempt to reframe the technology problem. This is one of the big trends, Stuart, is this, cybersecurity is, I'll say, maturing, maybe not quickly enough, but maturing into more of a business decision challenge as opposed to a technology challenge. So the prior few decades have been about, the adversary tradecraft and clever detection and fancy algorithms and so forth. And those are all part of it, right? We need all that. That's the science and the engineering that goes into security. But at the end of the day, this is about making business decisions. And so those business decisions to say invest in cybersecurity have to compete with every other risk decision that business leaders make, right? How much do I spend on reputational protection or safety for my employees, or all these other issues that are part of managing. I mean, running a business is about managing risks. And so if we're going to make the kind of progress we need in cybersecurity, then we have to present the understanding that we have gained in the language of business, as opposed to ask business leaders to become technologists, which is just not going to happen. So I think all that is really important. Again, the things that you mentioned, right, about what are the questions that business owners should be asking about their business, then translate into technology terms, right? What my service provider, my technologist, my CIO, and if you have one, all those that is the right approach to this, as opposed to the mystery of 10,000 patches and umpteen configuration changes, and that is just the engineering and the details. And if we cannot answer those natural business plain language questions satisfactorily, then really the onus is on the technologist, frankly. We should do better. And so as we've said, we've tried to design the way we both understand the problem, translate it into action in a way that makes it sensible to do that. Another thing is the streamlining. And Phyllis talked kindly about, I left her, for better or worse, with a bag of basic principles, right? Always think about these things when we develop our next generation. One of them, I'll let Phyllis talk to, is one ask per safeguard. That is a lot of this stuff, and you've read a million of these things, Stuart, right? These lovely long narrative paragraphs about here's a really bad problem and you need to do some stuff about it, and then the reader is left with, okay, what am I supposed to do here? I better hire a consultant to tell me what to do, right? And there might be one thing to do, and there might be 10 things to do, right? It depends on the reader. And Phyllis, so I left you stuck with that one. So tell me about, you might want to share with the group sort of what you did with that advice.
Yeah, so I think that advice, again, has stood the test of time. So before I came to CIS, I never thought about that. But one of, that Tony mentioned, one of our key services that we provide are mappings to other frameworks. And, Thomas Sager does an excellent job, yes, related to our great Tony Sager. He really does a great job with that. And it's not easy. And it's, reading things. And here's what we realized. You have to, when you map, it's not a one-from-one mapping. So those of you who use commercial tools, please note that when you have, a safeguard from like the CIS controls, we will say a subset or superset or equivalence. And so because we do that one ask per safeguard. So I'm just going to pick on our friends overseas who have a top 8, essential 8, or whatever, and one of them is application allow listing. Well, guess what? Application allow listing is comprised of many things. In order to have effective application allow listing, it's a little bit glib to say I'm asking you for one thing. You have to have hardware asset management. You have to have software asset management. You need to know what users get access to what applications, who's doing what, how is your network segmented so that these different applications are only available here. It is very, very complicated to do application allow listing. So while it is a safeguard that we have at CIS, in our prioritization, it's one of the last things, because you should have done all these prior steps. So that's really another strength of the controls, and this idea of one ask per safeguard is that there is a prioritization. There is, a way, a sequencing in implementing these safeguards so that you actually build upon prior safeguards. You're building upon prior implementation groups to actually have that kind of layered and effective cybersecurity program. Because if someone just says do application allow listing, well, yeah, you're going to have to get a consultant right out of the gate, because that is non-trivial. But you may have to get a consultant at the end anyway, but at least you will have built it, and you will have understood along the way, how complicated that actually can be, and what is it realistically that your organization can accomplish with that.
We have one last poll question that we're going to put up in a second, and it relates to knowing your assets. And it's, are you doing vulnerability management scans continuously during normal business hours? That becomes something that, gets to, do you know what your assets are, right? Because once again, if you're doing them monthly or you're doing them quarterly, probably doesn't give you a very good visibility to what the bad guys are seeing and what the bad guys might potentially do. So we wanted to put this up, let everybody respond to this, and just appreciate your thoughts on that. And then Tony and Phyllis, if you want to just provide a couple of I would say next steps, a couple of things that people can do to move towards the CIS 18, and as well as any maybe there's a link to something we ought to get to them.
Yep.
So it's kind of interesting. Even on this one, you see that 50% of them, are not doing continuous scanning, right? They do it weekly or monthly, and and maybe what's your reaction when you see that as it relates to understanding what you have?
Yeah, I think I'll just share. When in the wild and woolly days in the early Defense Department, all that, everything was kind of seen as a top-down. Okay, 30 days, and it's sort of like report, it sort of corresponded to the way we thought of physical reporting of stuff. And part of that was a recognition that technology was not that good, frankly, right? And we call that a self-denial of service attack. I remember being in a meeting with one of the senior person at the Pentagon, and I was commenting on some DoD policy, right? And the policy says something like, you'll do near real-time scanning for a certain kind of bad condition. And this person who was not an IT person goes, oh, near real time, that's like near beer or near, what? We should do real-time scanning of every report. Sir, you don't understand what that means to a computer scientist, right? You have just brought down the DoD network. That's a self-denial of service, and so there was this lack of understanding of what that really meant. Now, 30 days clearly didn't make any sense, but real time didn't either. And so you'd love to have the data or you'd love to have the frequency driven by the data, if you could, right? That is, because the shorter the window, the less dwell time for the attacker, the less exposure time for a outward-facing vulnerability, all that stuff. At the same time, you're balancing that with IT operations, right? The creation of lots of traffic and lots of data for reporting and dashboards and all that kind of stuff. And so we have tried to, where possible, tie the parameters within the controls to something sensible about that, recognizing it turns out we have to pick something. As Phyllis said, one of the scariest things about the controls, if we said 30 days, people did 30 days. If we said 7 days, they did 7. I go, oh my gosh, we don't have, we just took a sensible shot at it. But there are clearly folks that understand risk more, and then they'll make it more frequent and so forth. But you have to look at that as a trade-off between IT operations and that. But clearly, as I said before, right, the machinery is more, the program that you talked about, vulnerability scan versus program. The program is much more important. Having the machinery in place to look at pretty frequent intervals to identify these new unexpected devices, presence of vulnerable things is really, really important. And so if I were, when I was talking to auditors, audiences of auditors, I always use that phrase. You're better off verifying the machinery is in place than you are worried about the output of the one scan that happened to be run the day before you came, right? Yep. Because that's just a moment in time. The machinery is what you ought to be looking for. Is it in place? Is who's updating it, right? Who's reading reports? That's the thing that really, really matters.
So Phyllis, unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour, so I will let you give some very quick closing remarks, but we try and hold to the calendar integrity. So if you wouldn't mind.
No, that's good, because I need to go as well. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And I do think, we have this thing that Tony coined, it's not about the list. So whatever framework that you do choose, you really need to think about what is the ecosystem around it? What's, how is it that you can evaluate against it? How is it that you can, map perhaps or show compliance with other frameworks. What is it that that framework is allowing you actually to help enable your business? Not just here are some things to do, but within, you know, within your business, has that framework provided the other tooling that you need to help you run your business? And so we've tried to do that with the controls. Hopefully we succeeded. And, you know, post this call, if anyone has any questions, please reach out to us.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. We're a minute over. We'll hope to see you on other events that we have coming up. Here's the schedule in front of you. We will continue to publish these in December and January and February. As I mentioned, we're about to do something around cyber insurance and something around cyber liability. So feel free to reach back to us on those two areas if that's important to you as an end user organization, or if you'd like your MSP to be involved with that, let us know that as well. And with that, I want to thank everybody for their time. I apologize for being 2 minutes over, but thank you again for your participation today, for your questions, and to Tony and Phyllis for all your insights. We really appreciate everybody taking their time. Thank you and have a great weekend.
Thanks. Take care.